This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. This podcast is sponsored by the sour beer drinking folks at Foeder Crafters. They make foeders specifically for breweries and love every brewer they have ever met. Foeder Crafters would like to say thank you to all the good people in this industry. Cheers! Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is Jeffrey Stuffings, the co-founder of Jester Brewing here in Austin, Texas. We're here for the Brewers Retreat in Austin, and we're about to get started this afternoon brewing 4 different small batches with a bunch of celebrity brewers: Henry from Monkish, Trevor from DeGard, Jeff and Brian, Jeff from Jester King and Brian from the Austin Beer Garden, and Ken Grossman of Sierra Nevada is even coming to join us this afternoon. So
it's amazing.
It's an interesting, strange, wonderful, beautiful experience out here in Texas Hill Country. We've sat down out on some benches next to the farm that Jester King has just planted here. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Thank you, Jamie. Always great to talk to you.
Absolutely. The brewery has been taking a very agricultural turn as of late. It's interesting for me to watch how you've gone with this. Talk to me a little bit about why, the values that support that, and you've been a farmhouse brewery out here in Texas, Hill Country, or a farmhouse-ish brewery making beers in a farmhouse style, and you are now 6 years into this enterprise, or actually 7 years,
yeah,
right?
7 years since opening. Yeah.
Taking a very solid turn towards the agricultural, planting, buying property, hiring a farmer, planting on your own property, growing ingredients that you'll use to make your beer, adding goats. What's the impetus behind this and the impulse that's driving this largely agricultural shift for the brewery now?
Sure. I think, it comes back to kind of a single word or expression, that being authenticity. And it's something that we've really been striving for from the beginning. And I think it's been kind of a sliding scale. When we started out, everything was, pure culture, fermentation. And by no means is that a bad thing at all. But as far as making, a authentic farmhouse ale, I would define that as having kind of some interesting yeast character that's driven from nature. And so going from filtered well water, pure culture fermentation, to, raw well water, then wild yeast fermentation was kind of that first major step. And then along the way, we were able to get access to, local grains from our maltster Blacklands malt. And then I think the kind of latest major step in that direction has been starting a farm here at Jester King, which has taken a long time to do, really kind of from a financial perspective. I mean,
Sure.
Having enough extra cash to invest in hiring a farmer, buying land, right around the time, kind of craft beer, everyone was putting on capacity. We were putting money into to land to start a farm. Like that kind of really was our big, 2015 expansion project, was to buy 58 acres around us to start a farm. And, once we kind of adjusted to the new normal of having, taken on debt to do that, we were able to kind of get to the point where financially we could hire a farmer and start really just going wholesale into it. And, not that you must produce all your own ingredients to be an authentic farmhouse brewery. I wouldn't say it's the case, but I do feel that adds a layer of authenticity. And so being able with time to ultimately have, fruit that we grow on site, produce that we grow on site, to a certain extent, grain, and knowing full well that we'll always be sourcing our grain from our region now, which I think is a good thing. And then ultimately adding hops as well, which is kind of the missing link as far as our goal to ultimately produce what truly is a 100% Texas product, or hops, and they're quality hops and nothing, against any other producer elsewhere, but being able to really just have something that's 100% a Texas product is a big goal of ours.
That's a really interesting, approach to brewing. A lot of other brewers, that I would talk to have said, we're so glad we don't even do food because we just like to focus on making beer. I want to run one business, and that's a brewing business. You're not just running one brewing business, you're also now operating a farm. That's a pretty large departure from a typical brewing business approach. How do you manage through that? I mean, it has to then at some point pull you way back in to stay focused here rather than necessarily working on spreading the gospel of your beer around the country.
It actually has. I mean, I'm traveling a lot less these days than I used to. I kind of got wrapped up in doing events all over the world for a period of time over maybe the last 3 years or so, and really have kind of drawn back from that. And now fortunately our head brewer Avery and our staff can take that on very easily. And I still whenever there's going to be a collection of a lot of brewers who are friends together, I'll find a way to get there, even if it's for a day or two, just to keep up with my wonderful friends in the industry. Right. But aside from that, I'm spending a lot more time here. And I mean, if you kind of ask me what is the future of Jester King, I would say, it's a place that will be kind of a destination for all things fermentation. I fermenting grains and the love of beer will always be at the heart of it. It's the thing I'm most attracted to in the world of fermentation. But seeing the flavors and aromas that can be produced from these microbes applies to all manner of things agricultural, and seeing what can be done with other avenues of fermentation, whether it be meats or cheese or bread or other types of fermented beverages like wine or meat or cider, something we'd love to take on to, maybe our, legacy of this place out here would be kind of this, kind of ode to all things fermentation with the time.
What I find most interesting about this is that beer at its core is an agricultural product.
Right.
As with all, packaged goods that we may buy in various places, it's easy to separate, when you get your meat wrapped up in a styrofoam tray with a plastic coating on it, or, when you buy a beer in an aluminum can that's sitting in a cooler, it's easy to forget and break that connection between the agriculture that produces that beer. But at the core of it, barley and hops are agricultural products, and the beer that we make depends on that. And you are building a really tight connection between all of those things out here that really highlights that connection in a visceral way, where folks can come drink the beer and also see the fields where some of those ingredients are grown.
Absolutely. And I think, one thing that's kind of interesting, and it makes me think of, like, I was just listening to Joe Morfeld from Pine House just talking a moment ago, and talking about some of the similarities. Like, I would point to, for instance, whether it's, Joe and his beers kind of expressing kind of an agricultural region, presumably, Pacific Northwest, or, Live Oak here in Austin, their beers, expressing, some of the character of, like, the Czech Republic and regions of Germany. Or, I think of some of the breweries, like Agrarian Ales up in, I forget what town in Oregon they're in, but kind of being these beers that are expressive of place that are kind of more carefully engineered beers. So I don't want to suggest that, like, it needs to be this wild fermentation to really represent local agriculture well. And kind of being inspired by Franco-Belgian farmhouse ales. I think having that little bit of kind of interesting yeast complexity is kind of key for that. Part of
Sure.
those beers inspired from that place. But I just think beers that are expressive of place and region is important.
And I love this trend that I've started to see with estate-grown hops, or breweries, even on their packaging and labeling, talking about the origin of their malt and the origin of their hops.
Right.
Getting it down to the farm, and giving some of those growers credit for these ingredients that are really at the core of it, creating the paint with which the brewers paint these beautiful pictures in the beer itself. And that credit is a fascinating one. I really enjoyed a trip out to Yakima last year to see that. And when you see the folks that are raising these hops and the passion and love that they have for it and the connection, you can't help but be excited about highlighting that connection between the agriculture and the beer.
Right. No, absolutely.
Plus, you have really, really cute baby goats.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the goats. We have the farmer that we hired is his name is Peppy. That's not his real name, but everyone calls him Peppy.
Yeah.
And yeah, he actually lives in the goat barn with the goats. Yeah, he's very committed and
All right,
passionate
then.
to this process, and so the goats kind of have a dual purpose. One is to fertilize the farm. We do rotational grazing. We'll be like taking the pen and like every 3 months, like moving it to a different part of the property to fertilize. And then also we're currently working on trying to change Texas law to allow us to be able to make cheese out of raw goat's milk to be able to serve here at the brewery, both for being able to buy to take away as well as to use with the restaurant here on property. And so that's kind of the I was mentioning before, kind of wanting to do all things fermentation. That's kind of a first step into that world.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your move into spontaneous fermentation. When you launched the brewery, one of the first things you did was do some native, captures of local microflora that became a part of a bigger brewing culture that drives your beer. But one of the big moves that you made was to, in those early days, even start brewing spontaneous beer that you knew you're going to sit back and not release for years. But having said that, on the spontaneous side, you're a whole lot of latitude further south than typical spontaneous fermentation areas, and so that typical logic around needing to be in a much higher latitude where it's colder for more days of the year had to be a massive leap for you all to go spend the money, make the batches, throw it in oak, and then just wait and hope you got something that was really good. I mean, and you wouldn't know for a year or more, or 2 years for that matter, whether you got something good. Tell me a little bit about that leap of faith that you took.
Sure. Part of it was inspired by kind of that, you're told that it won't work. You're told that it can't happen. And, I've had both European and American brewers tell us that like spontaneous fermentation cannot be done in Texas. I've had people say that it can't be done outside of, the Zena Valley. And, these microbes are everywhere around us. I mean, all beer involved mixed cultures historically. And, so I just was a little skeptical that these beers could not be made outside of kind of this, traditional region of Europe or in farther northern latitudes of the United States. And, being in the hill country, we get pretty variable weather and we can have cold snaps. And, it snowed 3 times this past winter here in Texas. And so, I was just really, I don't know, a combination of just maybe just like pride or ego being told like, it won't work. And then, and also, just being very inspired by, Lambic and, I visited Cantillon for the first time in 2012 and just, it was just kind of like this surreal, mystifying experience to see that and wanting to see if it would work in Texas and already seeing that, Allagash had done, blends of spontaneously fermented beer that I thought was every bit as good as Goose. And that's, being done at least stateside. I'm like, surely this has a chance in Texas, but when the beer actually did start to ferment out well, it really was just like one of those moments like, our head brewer, Garrett Crowell and I at the time were just like hugging each other. Like we couldn't believe this even worked in Texas. And then
Psychologically speaking, I mean, you can pull those samples and it just may be awful and awful and awful and awful for months and months and months and months. And then like at what point did you taste that and say, oh shit, we have something good here?
Yeah, we didn't have to wait quite as long as I anticipated. I would say around the 6-month mark. It was rough around the edges and still like kind of bitter and had some weird mouthfeel, but like the aromatics were there and the beer hadn't totally gone off the rails. And just with our experience with barrel aged mixed culture fermentation, like we had enough of a grasp of where the beer was and where it was probably going to go that we felt we had something. It was I guess the beer, and this might sound odd in the context of spontaneous fermentation, but the beer was like clean enough at that point where like this is probably going to ferment out just fine. And so, that was kind of the sign that, this is going to work here. And that was pretty special, for us to observe that. And then, just in general, like the one thing I'd say about spontaneous fermentation, like as far as creating something that's a product of, place and time, it's kind of the ultimate cross section where that one night is going to produce a certain beer never to be recreated again. And, it's just very exciting to me just to see what nature can produce. I'm all for, beers that are very like carefully, technically precise and crafted. I love those beers, but I also love beers that are just like, just a product of the roll of the dice of nature. And that's fun to kind of, I had a musician once come up to me and said, he's a scholar of the musician John Cage, who I hadn't heard of. And he said that like Cage was like this like middle ground between like the intentional and the avant-garde. Like he would like play the same notes or attempt to, but do so on like musical equipment that was like just kind of some way faulty or would kind of create this natural variation where that's kind of what we do. Like our recipes very seldom ever change, but the ingredients and the microflora that goes into them just kind of takes the beer in its own direction. So, it's not intentionally variable. It's certainly not carefully, technically precise. It's just kind of this middle ground, which I don't know, has always appealed to us.
That seems to me a very wine-like approach, that there is vintage difference from year to year, and that variety and that change actually kind of flies in the face of this brewing monocultural idea that we've had, where everything needs to be perfect and the exact same and repeatable, time and time again. But having said that, in this kind of world of beverages, wine has created this idea that there is variation year to year, and that's okay, and that's something that we can celebrate. It is interesting to see beer embracing that same kind of mentality.
It is. When you're asking that, I couldn't help but thinking of, I had the, great fortuitous nature to go down to Chile for the Copa de Cerveza of the Americas. It was kind of like the craft brewers conference of South America, and they took the brewers who were there out to a winery, and I remember the winemaker there. It just was like, Brettanomyces. It's a contaminant. Like it cannot be brought into my winery. It makes bad wine, and I'm thinking this is something that exists like naturally on the skin of the grapes. Like, and I granted, I mean, if you want to select and kind of circumvent nature to create something that's a little more intentional, great, wonderful. I'm not knocking that, but as far as something that is very much supposed to be a product of agriculture, kind of embracing all of the different microbes and not specifically selecting, I think is very key. And when I see something marketed as a farmhouse ale that was fermented with a pure culture and maybe has some spices added to it to kind of mimic complexity and ferments dry in 3 weeks, then it's force carbonated and has a label with a tractor on it or a guy in a straw hat, I'm like, that's just not a product of agriculture. Like, and so again, it's not better or worse, but it's different. But if you're going to say like it's a product of, it's a farmhouse ale, like I think it really needs to incorporate, not just local agriculture, but also local microflora. I mean, people will disagree with that, but I mean, it's just kind of how I feel about it.
You do have some opinions that tend to be polarizing at times.
It's true.
So, and maybe we should talk about that a little bit. Last year or the year before, you started on a program to build some structure around the idea of beer made in that lambic and goose tradition. It came from a good place and a desire to differentiate, because within American brewers and the way that American brewers produce beer, there are very diverse methods for creating beers that are wild and sour and funky. Some of those are very traditionally inspired. Some of those are not traditionally inspired at all. All are valid methods. There's no such thing as an invalid method of brewing unless it's not food safe.
Totally agree.
And puts people in some sort of jeopardy. But having said that, when you're pitching a culture and calling it a spontaneous beer, then that's a strange place to be. But there are certainly brewers in the United States that are doing that. and that kind of flies in the face of some of that spontaneous, tradition and what consumers expect around that. You embarked on a program to try to, create some guidelines for what we call those, beers that are made in the Goose and Lambic tradition. And it ended up creating some controversy.
Right. It did. Yeah, I mean, we the first 3-year blend of spontaneously fermented beer we called, Methode Goose, in reference to kind of taking a cue from like Methode Champenois of just like referring to a process, but not a place, a region. Like, we've been very upfront that this is not lambic and it's not beer that comes from the Zena Valley and or Brussels and then unfortunately that kind of created some backlash from Hurral, and I get where they're coming from. I think
so. Hurral, the artisanal lambic maker group in Belgium.
Yes. I mean, through the process of kind of having some disagreement with them, I got a chance to talk to them quite extensively, and I think. I totally understand where they're coming from. They see it as like, this is our thing. We were doing it before it was cool. Like this is like, what my father and my grandfather and like this is our livelihood. And, they saw, I think, Jester King as kind of trying to like co-opt that tradition or like try to like, I think they saw us as kind of like, interlopers seeking to like steal what they had created. And, who we worked with and kind of coming up on like, Methode Goose was Jean from Cantillon, who knows us very well. And we've known him and like he understands like where we're coming from. And, I don't think I know I did not effectively.
He's also not a member of Hurral.
That too. Yeah. And so, I think I had not really like made our intentions well enough known and kind of who we were and why we were going about it. And, I think through that process and I shared with them, and I think, kind of in talking to Hurral, like the minute the light kind of went off with them is when I told them like, we did it because no one said we could, that was, the kind of that challenge. Like you can't make, lambic inspired beer in Texas. And trying to see if we could was a challenge, and I think that kind of resonated with them to kind of understand our motivation, and then also I think they appreciate trying to make beer that's a product of place, and I'm sure when you put our beer side by side with theirs, they would say it's quite different.
From a beer perspective, I mean, it is an interesting thing. Like, we call a Pilsner, and
right.
There doesn't seem to be any, cultural problem with, those beer makers in Pilsen, the Czech Republic, about, calling those beers that. We call Kolsch Kolsch.
Right.
And we're not brewing in Cologne, Germany. So, styles within our world of beer, as Americans understand beer and beer styles, do, tend to talk about the origin of where those beers come from. Even if they're not made in that place now, we try to append, Kolsch style ale or Pilsner style beer because obviously they're not brewed in that place. And that's common for Americans, but I guess the Europeans have a little tighter focus on their control of that appellation.
Yeah, I mean, when the kind of controversy started, happening, there were certainly plenty of people encouraging us just say, to give them the figurative middle finger and just like move on. But I mean, one of our first rules of business here at Jester King is like, do no harm. And, I could tell these people were very upset and felt offended and that their tradition was being co-opted. And so, which was obviously never our intent. And I felt like if we had tried to create like a category for lambic inspired beer in the United States that ultimately made a number of the traditional producers upset, then we will have failed in our right, mission.
Right.
So at this point, instead of calling, our spontaneously fermented beer, Goose, we'll simply call it a 3-year blend and refer to, making it in a traditional method. And, that seems to have kind of quelled any ill feelings. And then ultimately, I think where some kind of misinterpretation occurs is like, people think we're trying to like clone lambic. And well, yes, our beer has been inspired by that tradition. Like that's never been the intent. We're trying to make something that's, unique to our place and time. And I think, when a lot of people, I felt, our motivation was not what it truly is. I felt kind of called to react in somewhat of a opposite direction, just being very clear, like, no, we're not trying to just clone, bone goose. We're trying to make something that's unique to here. And, when it comes to something as simple as spontaneous fermentation, obviously for something like that, I don't think anyone on earth could ever say like, well, that's our thing. All beer was spontaneously fermented at a time. All beer at a time was a product of wild microorganisms. So, I think, we kind of entered that world and through I think my own kind of strategic and planning failures, it kind of didn't go well. And now I think that, there's enough awareness of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to do that, it'll all be okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not as passionate about the terminology as I was. And, now going back to the previous topic, I'm far more passionate about, starting our own farm and really just continuing to make sure this is a special place, especially as Austin grows around us and it becomes less of a rural environment. And, at least having the area that we own, being a place that's preserved for preservation and agriculture.
For sure. Let's talk a little bit about your spontaneous, process. Inoculation from your cool ship, all yeast from that is coming from that process. You're taking beer and putting it into completely clean barrels, steamed or otherwise cleaned, and not picking up any additional culture from the wood itself or from previous stuff that's been in there.
So a question I had going into making spontaneously fermented beers was like how much of the microflora is coming from the wood and how much is coming from the cool ship. And I mentioned this to the group earlier today. Like we filled a couple barrels in 2013 that had not passed through the cool ship, and were in barrels that had been steamed, and those barrels took about 3 months to start fermenting. So the microbes that were in the wood presumably ultimately caused that beer to ferment out, and it actually ended up being fairly good beer. Whereas the barrels that had passed through the cool ship started fermenting within days, really like within 3 to 5 days, everything had kicked off. So that suggested to me that the microbes driving spontaneous fermentation are what are collected in the cool ship and are not what is kind of residual in the wood. Like for instance, I mean, if you just took on a homebrewing level, if you just boiled some wort and put it into a carboy and put an airlock on it, I'm pretty sure that it wouldn't remain, just totally just unspoiled wort for forever. It would start fermenting with time. So can you create a totally blank slate with the barrels? No. But I think essentially by running a beer through a cool ship, you are kind of indirectly pitching yeast. And so I think, again, that's what's driving the ship.
Because lambic makers themselves have a whole variety of processes for cleaning their barrels, from chains to hot rinse to steam, and and there's no real code for how they go do that. And certainly that range of methods is you all with the method traditional and approach do specify clean barrels that aren't going to pick up a lot of that culture, which some lambic makers do dogmatically adhere to that, and others really don't.
Yeah. I mean, I to be totally honest, like I don't care. Like whatever they want to do. Like
fair enough. So let's talk. How do you guide some of that culture along? You certainly use hopping rates to manipulate some of the acidity in the beer. You use long boils to kind of build some of that caramelization that becomes characteristic of spontaneous beers. But tell me a little bit about that recipe development and then some of the techniques that you use that you found that have helped you produce better beer.
Sure. Hopping rates have been really key, not just for spontaneous fermentations, but our stainless steel mixed culture fermentations as well. For instance, one of our biggest inspirations would be like Thierry Extra, which is just this beautiful golden Belgian pale or Belgian saison, and it's pretty bitter. I think, I feel like I love New England IPA. I love
You're drinking one right now.
I'm drinking one right
Pine
now.
House Pizza.
Yeah. But I do feel like bitterness is something that needs to be like fought for a little bit in beer. I mean, again, some of my favorite beers, whether it be, from the German tradition or the Belgian tradition, are beers that are fairly bitter. And, like Durank XX Bitter is, one of those beers, or, Zinnebier from, De La Seine. I think that a lot people think, you hear bitter and you kind of this like negative reaction, and I feel like, and then you look at kind of
it's almost a human reaction, though. I mean, the human palate is kind of built to resist that idea of bitter to some degree, and so it becomes a learned taste.
Yeah, I think so. And my kids, they hate bitter, they hate spicy, so I think it is kind of somewhat of a acquired taste, and kind of removing bitterness from like India Pale Ale, and again, I like the juicy IPAs. They're great. I drink them a lot, but like I still want kind of your more classic kind of like West Coast, or even English, even though they're not quite as bitter, but still like your English.
Even with the hazy beers, those that finish with a little bit of a bitter finish, certainly help cleanse that palate and sweep some of that sweetness off your palate to allow you to take another sip and drink another beer, which, that's generally, if we're going to drink one, we want to drink two. So
exactly.
Making them a little more drinkable is a nice thing. Henry from Monkish yesterday was talking about his approach on that.
Oh, good.
And, his certainly have a little bit more of a bitter West Coast backing to them, even though they're hazy, which, aids that kind of drinkability.
Yeah, I think that to my palate, I think that's wonderful. And then the other part of that would be, in the context of the beers that we make, keeping the acidity balanced. I think, and again, I mentioned this earlier, but like, I think the biggest flaw in American sour beer over the last 4 or 5 years has been like overdone acid.
Yeah.
Where it's just like so harsh that it's hard to drink very much. And drinkable beer is something. I learned to brew by listening to people like John Palmer and Jamil Zainasheff, who, when I was Heretic in California, and like they would constantly preach the gospel of like just make it drinkable,
Right.
And the big beer kind of co-opted that for a period of time with like the difference is drinkability. I think that was the Bud Light tag for a couple of years, one of their marketing campaigns. But I mean, technically they got it right. I mean, yeah, it should be drinkable. Not to suggest that adjunct lager is the only drinkable style. Of course, that's false. But so how do we do that? Well, blending is key. Quality fermentation is key. But hopping rates is a huge part of that. And a lot of our beers tend to finish at like 20 to 35 IBU, and for like a quote unquote like sour beer, that's quite high. But it's just because we want kind of fairly mild quenching acidity and not have acidity be the driver or the star of the show.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways for American sour beer makers today. And it's certainly what we find in that there's almost a regionalization to some of that desire for massive acidity. It seems that California tends to attract big folks, love that kind of acid. And I've certainly talked to, a number of brewers there who make those beers and have said it, to me, again, off the record, that they wish they could make more subtle beers. Huh. But there's almost a consumer desire and demand for higher levels of acidity. It's almost, to some degree within, consumer circles that in the same way that they were, folks, beer buyers were searching for more and more, bigger and bigger, more IBUs in their beer. Now they're, those sour beer fans are searching for more and more, acidity in their beer as some sort of machismo. I can drink the most acidic beer. And, now today, if you ask Henry about hazy IPAs, they're looking for more and more Platos in those, finished beers, and sweeter.
Really?
And so there seems to be that we have a hard time within the world of beer, finding, and celebrating that concept of nuance and balance, where all of these things are existing in a nice tension with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think of, just like what you're after commercially. I mean, if it's something where you're trying to appeal to like a sweeter, more like mass produced, and granted, very few craft breweries I ever put at the level of barrelage where it's kind of mass produced, but like I I feel like, I always come back to like the, mantra of like, I read an article when I was starting this place called like, 1,000 true fans, meaning that like, if you can find like 1,000 people who are like really into what you do, it was in the context of music, like buy all of your albums, like just appreciate who you are for who you are, you can make a living at that. And, we make 2,000 barrels. Like we don't have to cater. We don't have to do anything resembling, back sweetening or I wouldn't even know how to make our beer like not fully fully attenuated. So I mean, I don't know. I just like it just really kind of is like nails on a chalkboard for me to hear like, we're going to like intentionally make our beer finish sweeter to appeal to like a ticker culture, or like, this kind of culture of like, what presented the best in like a, a half ounce pour at a bottle share. Like, I just don't care. Like I want people to drink my beer and do so under a live oak tree and have, fun with it and enjoy conversation, and human interaction, which is the whole point of alcohol in the first place, is to, make it easier for humans to have a good time together. So I don't know, just that stuff, it's never been a popularity contest for us. I mean, granted we have to make a living, but like fortunately, 2,000 barrels a year is not a hard sell. And, selling most of it on site, it's at such a margin where we don't have to cater to anybody and can stand for our own principles. Not that they're right or wrong, they're just what we believe in. So I don't know, I find that really disheartening to like, we're going to make IPA sweeter for like, some dude reviewing it at a bottle share.
That's an interesting point you bring up. And then that mode of consumption and how beers are consumed, I think, is a curious one. And we see it all the time. Like, oh, my buddies and I got together and we drank, 12 of these and then we ranked them. And that's when you put this kind of effort into seeking out beer from around the country, trading for it and waiting in lines for it and everything else, you feel like there is a weight to that from that consumer perspective, and that you want to, you're not going to drink one of those bottles by yourself. But it becomes a tough thing from a brewer perspective for you to, try to make beers that get consumed, with where people can drink an entire glass of it and, ponder it, sit with it, or even not ponder
right.
it. And, spend time with their friends as they share something that's just delicious to drink. From a commercial perspective, like, you can't tell people how they can drink your beers, whether they can bottle share with them.
Sure.
But how do you try to, get that into the right place so people can enjoy it in the way that you intend for them to?
Yeah, I think that the taproom model is the answer, and I know we're not alone in that. And I mean, if you listen to like Bart Watson at the VA, like he talks about how a lot of the growth you're seeing is from the on-site taproom experience, and that's something we strive for here as well. And fortunately, we can sell 2/3 of our beer at the brewery, and
you've consciously pulled that back and done less distribution in order to sell more beer here.
Yeah, I hope we can get to 85%.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what we're striving for, even more on-site sales with time as the area grows around us.
And you'll just make it more rare because of that, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, the irony.
Yeah, I guess, there was a period of time when we'd be at a beer festival and, I'm sitting there behind our booth and I'm watching, some of my favorite farmhouse ale producers, like Side Project and Perennial and Hill Farmstead, people just running past their booths to get, the latest, adjunct stout and it's fine. Whatever people are happy with, I don't care. But it's just kind of just funny to see that occurring. And fortunately, I guess there is to be perfectly transparent, there probably is some ego and within do people line up to come seek your beer. And we had our release of a beer called Elements of Composition, which was a blend of beer from DeGard, Sante Darius, and us, and totally unfruited. And yeah, it had an amazing response. It was lousy 40-degree weather and was misting out, and people were just still really, really geeked to show up early and make sure they got a bottle of that beer. And I was like, wow, it's a beer that doesn't have a whole lot of adjunct ingredients, is unfruited, and it's just this thing that I think is very subtle and balanced, and people cared about it, which was kind of a heartening thing to see. But even if they don't, I would say that the good thing is when I talk to our distributor locally who represents like the Shelton Brothers portfolio in Texas, and, hearing about, again, some of those breweries inspired us, like, like Duranc and De La Seine and Jolly Pumpkin. And, those beers do quite well in our state, even if they're not, the ones that are, just over the top hyped. So I don't know. I think, I think like a lot of things, what do they say in politics? It's like, the vocal minority, so I think, some of the fireworks involved in beer draw a lot of attention, and that's fine. But, when it comes to just beer for drinking, I still feel like there's a strong audience for that, and probably one that, is very much increasing as more and more people, kind of drift away from macro lager.
Well, you've found a way to make some interesting and curiously drinkable beers out of strange and unsuspecting ingredients. I've just finished about a half a bottle here of Obsession, a collaboration beer that's 100% spontaneously fermented that you made with Scratch Brewing, Aaron and Mark, from scratch. And it is, despite being I shouldn't say despite, I'd say
That's all right.
As a result of being a foraged beer, which has certain connotations that come with it. It is, mildly sweet and, or at least presents that way, and remarkably drinkable.
Yeah, I think one thing that kind of helped us with that is that it was a winter harvest of foraged ingredients, so there was kind of a natural kind of drying process that went on with the fallen leaves and the spice bush and grapevine and sassafras, where I feel like some foraged beers I drink have like a little bit more like kind of like green or like chlorophyll character that sometimes can be a turnoff, and I'll say guilty as charged with some of our foraged beers. I think I've had a little bit too much of like a green character, so in some way kind of doing like a winter foraging I think lent it to be kind of a more drinkable beer, and one that I really enjoy despite having some kind of somewhat like weird like wintergreen type of flavors. It's still something that I could drink a bottle or two myself, and then just brewing with Scratch. I mean, gosh, I just think the world of them as far as just being good people making something that's just such an amazing product of place and doing it in like as authentic of a manner as any brewery could do, in my opinion. So, it was pretty special to get to brew with Marka and Aaron. They're the real deal.
For sure. So, you're also a small business owner in addition to being a brewer. From that perspective, what keeps you up at night?
Oh, it's funny. I got into opening a brew with my brother because we loved beer and we wanted to make it and drink it and just talk beer all day and geek out about beer, and it's something we still love to do, but you realize like anything that is going to be worthwhile is other than being like holed up if like a I don't know, I suppose if you're like a writer or some professions you still can kind of be totally by yourself, but I mean I feel like any collection of people that comes together is going to take an enormous amount of energy to kind of get everyone inspired and pulling in the same direction. Like you realize real quick that you can try to do the work of two people, but you'll never be two people. And if you can only kind of have success by your ability to kind of motivate and inspire others to kind of carry out your vision. And so trying to build like a culture where people are motivated to, bring our philosophy, to others has been very fulfilling. But yeah, what an enormous headache on many levels. Like, I'm like, and I couldn't help but thinking, Walt was right. Like, let's just give up on all this.
Ooh, wow.
I'm kidding. I quickly rebound from those days.
So you're going to sell to ABI, huh, Jeff?
No. But you have many of those days when it's just like, oh gosh. But then ultimately, like on those good days, it's just like so much more fulfilling to see a collection of people create something special that I think I'd get bored very, very quickly, not kind of getting to be part of this. And the other thing is like it grows past you where like I recognize, and it's obviously, honestly, kind of been more like a motivating factor where you recognize that like the business is like morphed into something far greater than yourself, and realize that like no one is bigger than that cohesive, whole that has been created. And so, that kind of responsibility that comes with that is very motivating as well.
Fantastic. So if people want to learn more about Jester King, you have a fantastic new website, huh?
Oh, yeah. We entered the 21st century now with our website. That was, one of those things that, getting the brewery off the ground, we put like $100 into getting a website.
Sure,
and so,
sure.
And then it never really gotten around to, it was like on a perpetual to-do list item that like never got done. But thankfully, we're at the point now where there's other really talented people here. So that got delegated. And sure enough, once that happened, it was done in like 3 months. And so.
Hey, where can people find you then?
Same URL, just jesterkingbrewery.com.
Cool. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me on the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. It is a beautiful location out here in the Texas Hill Country. I've been drinking your beer for years, and this is my first visit to the brewery. And, it's a mildly spiritual experience just from a fanatic standpoint. And I really appreciate being able to talk to you out here right next to your farm on your own property. Wonderful thing that you're doing here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie.
We're going to brew some beer this afternoon.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Thanks
so
a lot.
much.
Cheers.
This podcast is sponsored by the sour beer drinking folks at Foeder Crafters. They make foeders specifically for breweries and love every brewer they have ever met. Foeder Crafters would like to say thank you to all the good people in this industry. Cheers! This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.